friends, Krista here. Thanks for stopping by Books and Jams. Today I'm going to be talking about a lot of the different stats and review and just looking back at my 2018 reading year. I'm also going to include my least favorite, or I guess more disappointing reads from the year, 5 of those, and 5 of my favorites from the year. I'm just going to combine it all into one video because I don't have the time or desire to make separate videos for each of them. So hopefully I'll be able to put timestamps down in the description box below for stats, and then most disappointing, and then favorites. I'll end with that. So we end on a high note. Taking a look at some of my stats for the year, I read 127 books in 2018, which is by far my biggest year of reading ever. 2 factors contributed to that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But in January, I read a bunch of short books. I went through my shelves and kind of pulled out all the shortest books I could find and read those during January. And then in March, for middle grade March, I attempted reading a book every single day, or completing a book every single day. And I read 29. So I didn't quite make it, but very close. So between those 2 things, that's what contributed to my beefed up numbers for books that I read in 2018. I also read 42,221 pages. That's a lot, but I don't really look at the number of pages from year to year, so I have no idea how that compares to other years. I just don't know. The longest book that I read in 2018 was Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett, and that, I don't remember how many pages that is. It's like 900 something pages, super long. The shortest book that I read was Sea Prayer by Khaled Hosseini. I read that in December. Very short, less than 50 pages, I think. It's more of a poem with a lot of beautiful artwork, but I'm still counting it because it's a book that I read in 2018. The oldest published book that I read in 2018 was Much Ado About Nothing, and now I wish I wrote down what year it was. I'll put the year down here. That's the oldest book that I read, and I wonder what the most recent release. I didn't look up what the most recent one was. I'm getting all these stats kind of from Goodreads, but I missed when they posted the year in review of writing everything down, so I kind of went through and found some stats on my own. The month with the most pages was March. I read 8,114 pages in March, and in September was my smallest month. I only read 4 books, but it was still 1,343 pages in September, and that was the smallest. As for my ratings, I gave out 33 5-star, 61 4-star, 25 3-star, 6 2-stars, and 2 1-star ratings, which star ratings are so hard for me. Clearly 4 stars is like the norm. That's my biggest category. To make it to be 5 stars, there has to be something that sets it apart. And 3 stars were like, meh, it's okay. But 4 stars are like, oh yeah, I liked this book. I enjoyed it for whatever reason. I very, very rarely give out really low ratings. So let's move on to my most disappointing reads of the year. These are books that I, for the most part, had kind of high hopes for or expected something different than what I got when I read it. So these are in no particular order, but last January I read Bridget Jones' Diary by Helen Fielding, and I really didn't care for it. It annoyed me. Bridget Jones as a character annoyed me. I didn't find much that was good for me about this book. I know that so many people love it. I'm just not one of those people. So we're starting right off with an unpopular opinion. Another book that I was really disappointed that I didn't love is One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a book that was so highly praised on BookTube from people that I watch, and I didn't care for it. I found it to be very predictable. I didn't love the writing. I didn't love the story. I didn't like the outcome and the ending. Yeah, it was just very disappointing. I was really hoping to like it. I'm very hesitant to pick up other books by her now, especially The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, because I didn't care for the first book of hers that everyone seemed to love. And so I'm super wary that Taylor Jenkins Reid just isn't for me. Contemporary romance, as a general rule, isn't for me. So maybe that's part of it as well. But yeah, I didn't like that one. Another disappointing read was Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. And I think this is one that just helped me to realize I don't really care for dark thrillers. I don't mind a mystery, but when it gets really dark and gritty, it's just not for me. It was so drastically different from my value system, which I read books that don't match up with my values all the time, but for some reason Sharp Objects really struck a negative chord with me, and I decided that Gillian Flynn is no longer for me. I unhauled Dark Places, which I hadn't yet read, and I unhauled Sharp Objects as well. Actually, I've unhauled all of those so far. They are no longer on my shelves, which is why the pictures are here. The fourth book that was kind of disappointing to me was Thornbirds by Colleen McCullough. I read this because it was a book that was recommended to me in 2017 when I did my BookTuber Recommends project. The Bedtime Book Club girls from Australia, who no longer make videos, which is so sad because I loved them. But they recommended Thornbirds as a book from Australia that I should read. And I had heard so many people, not so many people, it's not a widely talked about book anymore. It's pretty old. I forget when it came out, but it's an older book. And the main reason that I didn't like this book is because of the main relationship. It's kind of an epic book. It follows decades worth of time, but the main relationship in the book is between a priest and a young girl. Nothing happens that's inappropriate really, except his feelings, until she's older. But it just didn't sit well with me. And the whole book kind of revolved around their relationship. So her family really, but their relationship was a big central part of this book, and I just didn't care for it. So that was pretty disappointing. And it's kind of a big book too. It was on my big books pile of ones that I wanted to read in 2018, and I read it all the way through, and it was a page turner. Like I continued to be interested, but overall I was just disappointed. When I look back at the books I read this year, it was one of my least favorites. So I'm including it in this list. The fifth book that I want to talk about that was kind of disappointing is A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This is the sequel to A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which I absolutely loved. So I had really high hopes for Closed and Common Orbit, and I ended up enjoying it by the end of the book. I did listen to it on audio, and I wonder if that was part of the reason why I didn't love this book, but the whole first half, I was just waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. I was bored. I wanted to DNF it multiple times. I ended up being glad that I pushed through because by the end it was okay. And I did really enjoy the whole process by the time it came to the end. But for more than half the book, I was not enjoying myself, so it made it onto this list of 5 disappointing reads. Let's move on to my favorite books of the year. And now, again, I had 33 5-star books this year and 61 4-star books. So overall, it was a fantastic year of reading. So it's really difficult to narrow it down to 5 books. So I just kind of picked 5 different topics and categories, I guess you could say, and my favorite book from that category in order to just talk about my 5 best. These are in no particular order. There's no possible way I could do that to put them in order because there's just so many good ones. However, I also want to mention that I'm not including any middle grade books in this list because at the end of March, I did talk about my favorite middle grade books from that month, and books like Nevermore and Girl Who Drank the Moon and Echo and The War That Saved My Life and Wish Tree. All of those were so fantastic, and if I made an ultimate list of my favorites from the year, more than one of those would probably be on that list because I just absolutely loved them. But since I already talked about those as favorites, I decided not to include those now. But I do have 5 books that I want to talk about that were among the best of the best for me this year. Okay, the best current contemporary, I actually have a tie for this because I didn't know how to separate these two. It was Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman and Beartown by Frederick Bachman. I absolutely loved both of these books. I don't read tons of contemporary either, so the fact that I have 2 that I absolutely loved really made me happy. Eleanor O is how I always write it. Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine is about a woman who kind of is super socially awkward. We're inside of her head for much of the book, but she works, she has a steady job and lives on her own, is a successful person in general, but she's very lonely. She doesn't have any friends. But in this story, she makes friends with a person from her work and this elderly gentleman, and it's just such a beautiful story. She's so quirky and funny. Her stream of consciousness, the way she thinks, is so funny and pretty sarcastic, which I don't hear people talk about that often, but just the way she perceives the world was a lot of fun for me to read. But there's a lot of heartache and tragedy from her past that kind of comes out through the book too, and kind of made her the way she is. I just really enjoyed reading about Eleanor Oliphant, and I look forward to more from Gail Honeyman. Also, Beartown by Frederick Bachman. This year, Frederick Bachman moved to one of my favorite authors, Otto Reed. Anything he writes, I want to read it. I haven't read everything yet. I've read 3 now, and definitely want to read more from him. He's so good. Beartown is about this hockey town where the hockey team, this young boys hockey team, is the center of everything in this town. And at one point, one of the boys from the team makes a really serious decision that was horrible and awful, and that becomes this focal point, but for how does the town respond to these events. The girls' family and the hockey team and the rink and all of the ramifications of that. I am not a huge hockey fan, but I absolutely loved this book because it's really about these people in this town and how they respond to this situation. So many quotable lines from this book, and I read this together with Lindsay from Lindsay's Little Library and loved reading it with her because we just had so much to talk about. It was definitely fantastic. Another book that I loved this year would be my favorite historical fiction, I guess I'll say, and that was White Chrysanthemum by, Marilyn Bracht. The picture is here. White Chrysanthemum is a World War II historical fiction, but instead of dealing with Germany and Jewish concentration camps and that side of things, we are in Japan and Korea. And there's this family, these 2 sisters. One of the sisters gets kidnapped by a Japanese soldier and forced to become a comfort woman on the front lines of the Japanese army, which is basically these brothels where they kidnap women and force them to be sex slaves, ultimately. We also follow the sister who did not get kidnapped and how the war affected her and her family. It was a heartbreaking story. It was another side of the women's side of war. Heartbreaking, very moving. I cried buckets, very enlightening, and so well written. I just really, really enjoyed. Enjoy is not the right word. I'm glad that I read this book, and it definitely is one of the top books I read this year. I think my favorite nonfiction, I'm including a nonfiction even though I only read a handful of them, but my favorite nonfiction this year was definitely Educated by Tara Westover. This is the story of Tara Westover and her life and how she grew up in a survivalist family in the mountains of Idaho. Her parents wanted nothing to do with the school system and the medical system in America, and they kind of lived off the grid preparing for Y2K. So they did canning and they built bunkers, and there was a lot of tough stuff going on in her family. She tells about that lifestyle and about some abuse that she experienced at the hands of family members. But then she also tells about how, following in her brother's footsteps, she taught herself from textbooks that she found or bought so that she could pass and get her GED and end up going to college, kind of breaking against her family's way of thinking and the way that she had been raised in order to educate herself, and where that process brought her. It was so much a page turner for me, which for nonfiction is so rare. I couldn't get enough. I read it so quickly. I was just so enthralled with her story that even afterwards I went on YouTube and looked up interviews and listened to more of her talk. That was definitely my favorite nonfiction of the year. The last one I want to talk about is a mystery suspense thriller kind of book, and that is Tangerine. And I can't remember the author of this one either. Sorry guys, I'll put the picture. Tangerine was so good. So it follows this woman, I don't remember her name, and her husband. They have moved to Tangier, and it's so atmospheric. This book has a very almost gothic feel to it. It's not a gothic novel, but it feels oppressive and dark, and you feel the heat and the sweat. And this the wife in this family is basically agoraphobic. She doesn't leave her house at all. But then one day, her roommate from college, who was a very close friend of hers, shows up in Tangier, and things get a little strange. Reading it, you are not quite sure what to think about these characters. Who's good? Who's bad? Is she telling the truth? Is she lying? You just don't know as you read it. And it was such a fun ride. It's a short little book. It's not very long, but it was really, really good. And the ending, I think my jaw dropped at the ending. Like, no, don't end there. You need to keep, like, what a horrible ending in the best way. Because it just gave one little last twist with the end part of it that just blew me away. It was so much fun. Such a fun read. Christine Mangan. I remembered the author. Yes, something like that. Anyways, those are my best. Those are the books that I would like to talk about for my favorites of the year. There were so many good books this year. The Guernsey Literary Potato Peel Pie Society was a favorite. Scythe by Neil Shusterman was so good. The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivey, Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. There just were so many good books. So that's it for me. I would love to hear from you. What was one or two of your favorite books that you read in 2018? What was one or two that you didn't love in 2018? I would love to hear that from you down in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll be seeing you soon in another video. Bye. January. Why do I always have to sneeze?